Tonight, our national vaccine strategy has been thrown off course and is at risk of further delays after blood clot links to AstraZeneca. Welcome to Q&A. Hi there, and a very warm welcome to the program. Joining me tonight on the panel, Liberal member for North Sydney, Trent Zimmerman, Wiradjuri Wale One woman lawyer Teela Reid, Labor member for Lily, Anika Wells, Managing Director of the Australian Christian Lobby, Martyn Iles, and journalist, diversity advocate and author, Antoinette Lattouf. Please make all of them feel welcome. We'll also have live music for you later on in the program tonight. The wonderful Robbie Miller will be here to perform for us. You can stream us online, live on iView and all the socials as always, and you can join the conversation on Instagram and Twitter. Quanda is the hashtag. Please do keep it respectful. Our first question tonight comes from Sarah Smage.
Do I stand up?
You can stay seated, but go for it.
Thanks. Personally, I look forward to everyone being vaccinated, but I then know that there's a lot of people who fear the vaccine or believe that the government might have another agenda behind the vaccination process. Some of this is due to the vaccine being developed faster than any has before. With the news today that the AstraZeneca vaccine has been linked to some blood clotting, and that those of us under 50 have to take or should have been advised to take the Pfizer vaccine instead, what are the government's plans to persuade those that are vaccine hesitant or afraid to take the vaccine to take the vaccine in order to reach herd immunity for everyone else?
All right. Trent.
Well, thanks for that question. And I think that it is an important issue that we face. But the first thing I'd say is that the vaccine is the world's way, Australia's way out of the pandemic. And we're not going to get back to anything like our normal existence until we have a large proportion of the Australian community that have been vaccinated. It has been a miracle of modern medicine and science that we've been able to develop the range of vaccines that the world has available to it over the last 12 months. It's fair to say 12 months ago, there were many that doubted that we'd be at this point, and I think we can be extraordinarily proud of our science community wherever they are in the world, and including here in Australia. I think what is important to recognise is that in a vaccination program like this, safety comes first, and what we've seen today is, following some advice and some analysis from our European friends, a very precautionally, an abundantly cautious approach to the AstraZeneca vaccine. But safety will always be the primary consideration, and that's what's going to happen as we continue the rollout of the vaccine.
Undoubtedly, though, this throws Australia's vaccine rollout into disarray. This is what the Prime Minister said during his press conference tonight.
The task now, overnight and through the course of tomorrow and over the weekend, there will be a recalibration of how the program will need to be adjusted to take into account the decision the government has taken tonight to accept those recommendations from ATAGI. As Health Minister has just said, there are, of course, Pfizer vaccines that are in Australia, and we are getting a regular supply of those, and they can be prioritised against the individuals for whom that will be the more appropriate vaccine for them. But we will just have to work through the logistics of that and the calibration of how that is done, and that will be our task now. This
is a very big moment for Australia, isn't it?
Well, it's a big moment for the world because AstraZeneca is the vaccine that the majority of the world is going to use, and that has consequences if this advice is adopted by other countries as well. But the first thing I'd say is that the incidence of this blood clotting is incredibly low. We're talking about 6 at max in every million people.
So is it an overreaction to do this?
No, I think that particularly to respond to that type of vaccine hesitancy that we talked about before, it's really important that we actually make clear to the community transparently that we're putting safety as number one priority. What's important to note, though, is that it will continue the rollout for over 50s. We're in phase 1B and 1A, which is in terms of the 6 million people in 1B, people over 70, so they'll be able to continue to receive it. 2A, which some of us might be in for over 50s, it will be able to continue with AstraZeneca as well. And we have 20 million doses of Pfizer that are coming regularly, obviously not in one block, but will continue to come through the year. And we've got 50 million doses of Novavax, which will come later in the year if it passes all of the tests.
I want to go to the rest of the panel, but I just want to gauge how many in our audience are impacted by this. So now if you're under 50, you won't be recommended the AstraZeneca vaccine, you'll be prioritised for Pfizer. So who's under 50 here tonight? So that is the vast majority of our audience. I think there's someone here. Elise, you had the jab today. You're under 50, that's right?
Yeah.
And you're essentially a frontline worker. Which one did you get?
AstraZeneca.
So how do you feel about the news?
It would have been nice to get it 24 hours ago, but I mean, I don't regret getting vaccinated. I think it's important to do. Hopefully everything will be okay.
OK. Anika, this is a pretty difficult moment for Australia, isn't it? We banked a lot on AstraZeneca.
It is, and I think Trent's right in that we are all on a unity ticket and that we all want this to succeed. You know, we all want this to work. And Australians really set the global standard in looking after one another, locking down in a way that reduced our COVID numbers. And our reward for that was meant to be that we would be able to get back on track and, you know, for our economy, for us to maybe get the jump start on other countries where it wasn't going so well. And now all that is in jeopardy, and it feels like we're failing at the first hurdle, and that's because our government, the very first difficulty of procurement, we don't seem to have any clear direction or answers about that. It comes to, I think, the Prime Minister's judgment about the vaccines that he chose, the numbers of those doses and why. When the UK, the US chose other pathways like Moderna or Johnson & Johnson.
Are you saying we've backed the wrong horse with AstraZeneca, putting so much effort into it?
We've been saying since last year that we need more horses in the race. We need 5 or 6 different vaccines.
We've got 5. We've invested in 5.
Well, if they're coming down the line, things like Novavax are months and months and months away. And I think Sarah's right. People are worried. I had a mobile office this morning in Deagon. People were talking about their concerns. We had a snap lockdown in Brisbane last week. But things like JobKeeper, we were told by the Treasurer that the timing of that was based around the vaccine rollout being well underway by now. That's not the case. But JobKeeper payments got cut off last Sunday.
Teela, Reid, do you think the government has hedged its bets too much on the AstraZeneca vaccine?
I just think back to the question. It's about the country having options available to be vaccinated. And, you know, I think, to be honest, it's no surprise to me about the government's incompetence to handle this and administer the vaccine and keep us safe. It has been absolutely the people who have, you know, come together and kept safe and, you know, locked down and done the right thing through the social contract. And I just think that, you know, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the majority of us are under 50. The average age of a First Nations person is 23. And I think that it's just been completely reckless and unacceptable in a developed country that we are here now and we're still waiting for the option to be vaccinated.
Antoinette?
I don't know. At the beginning of the week, the Prime Minister had one problem, and right now he has a very different problem. At the beginning of the week, it was like, we're not getting them fast enough. We were going to apparently lead the world in terms of vaccinating really quickly. Well, hey, isn't it pretty good that we didn't do that? Because we have a benefit of a little bit of hindsight. And the people that I've spoken to, and I use my WhatsApp group with my very many cousins as a sample. I'm related to almost half of Western Sydney. And I was chatting to them last night, and I talked to everybody at the gym, and the general sentiment was, you know, we're living relatively well in Australia, given how well we're doing. Yes, we are an island. We have our freedom. We're still going to, you know, we've got a great live audience here tonight. And we can afford to wait a little bit and see how it pans out.
Can I just say that it has flow-on effects? Like, for example, it's not just the administration of the vaccine, it's people's real lives that are being affected. And sure, the majority of people live comfortably. But for example, an example is, you know, last weekend I had tickets to the Blues Festival, which was one of the biggest, you know, festivals ready to happen up on Bundjalung country. And that affected the arts in so many ways, where there was that breakout
Would you rather
up there.
the arts be affected or
the
have
flow-on
more incidents
effect,
of blood
the flow-on
clots?
effect I'm talking about is this. If that's going to happen, is there a backup plan to support this industry where, you know, the arts have really suffered? I enjoy going to the arts. And while, yes, I everyone's sacrificed not going to something like that. But at the end of the day, we need bigger plans and bigger strategies around, sure, some people live comfortably, but other people have been really affected by this. And I think we need to think broadly about how the government, one, are administering it, but also two, supporting and backing the arts industries and people in the creative fields.
Martyn Iles, will this lead to more vaccine scepticism and hesitancy, do you think?
Yeah, look, I think it could. I think my contribution would be twofold. I think, firstly, I agree with Antoinette, which is that basically we don't need to manufacture a crisis over the vaccine when we just don't have one, which is, yes, the rollout's been a little slowish, but at the same time, we do not have a massive problem with COVID in the country. And actually, it's turning out that there's some benefits of watching the rest of the world go just a little bit ahead of us. So I'm fine with that.
That could change at any moment, though, couldn't it? There could be an outbreak. It could get out of control very easily, as we've seen.
It could, but I think we've actually got extremely good at controlling the outbreaks. I think, for example, what happened in Queensland just recently, very, very good response and very rapid response. And so I think we're in a pretty good place. And I think the possibility that the vaccine stuff could go wrong, it seems to be proven that it won't. And you mentioned vaccine scepticism. I think it builds confidence in people if they can watch and wait just a little. And I'm going to go in to bat for, going to take a little, probably slightly unpopular take, which is that there are people in the community, as was mentioned, who have vaccine hesitancy. And there are some people who feel as though they, in good conscience, can't take the vaccine. I actually want to go into bat for them just for a second, because I think we can actually respect someone's conscience and achieve public health outcomes possibly at the same time. So I think we should let the vaccine rollout take place. Everyone who wants it should get it. That'll be the vast majority of people. There'll be some people who don't want it. I reckon leave them alone, because the protection of conscience matters, and we might think they're very silly, we might think that they're very ignorant, we might laugh at them for their conscientious concern, but it might be our conscience on the block one day. So I'd like to respect their conscience as a first port of call, and perhaps when we get to the end of this process, we'll have herd immunity, and those few conscientious objectors will not compromise the situation.
Could they not, Teela, Reid, not harm other people? If there are people that are so-called conscientious objectors to the vaccine, that could harm people ultimately, couldn't it?
Well, I'm not a health expert, but people's free choice is people's free choice. I think the real issue, though, is the administration of the way in which the government has handled COVID-19. Like, I personally don't think that they can take responsibility for the success of that we've had. It has absolutely been people taking care of other people in relation to our success as a country. It's been the people on the front line doing it. I mean, you know, I can't speak from a health expert opinion.
Right.
I think by any barometer, and I think this is a point as we sit here today, that if you look at what's happening around the world, you wouldn't want to be anywhere else other than Australia or maybe our cousins across in New Zealand. And it has been a phenomenal effort. I think actions of state and federal governments, and most importantly the community, has allowed us to get to this situation. But I mean, just this year we've seen 50 million cases around the world, 1 million deaths around the world. We had our first death, someone that had come from Papua New Guinea for treatment last week. We have been doing remarkably well, and that's not an excuse for unduly delaying the vaccination program, because we want to reconnect with the world. But I think that it has been right to let the TGA, the regulator, do its job. Phase 1B will continue, Phase 2A will continue, which is the over 50s, and that gives us the time to be making sure that we're ramping up our supplies of Pfizer, seeing whether we can bring in earlier Novavax.
Can we get more Pfizer? Can we get Novavax earlier?
We've got 20 million doses of Pfizer, so that's enough for 10 million Australians. So that's a big part of the population, particularly if AstraZeneca is used for the I think 12 million people over 50.
But how soon will that get here?
So Pfizer's been coming in quite regularly. Thankfully, it has not had the supply issues that we saw with AstraZeneca, which deprived us of 3 million AstraZeneca doses. But so Pfizer has been coming in regularly, and that's going to continue. Novavax, we're talking about the third quarter of this year, but obviously, particularly in the light of today's developments, the PM and the Health Minister have already flagged that they're going to be talking to Novavax to see whether that can be brought forward. But remember, it hasn't finished the approval processes. So all the signs are promising, but we're not completely at the end of the processes as they go through before it's made available.
OK, let's take our next question. It comes from Rachel Worthy.
Hi. So Anika says that she's a proud beneficiary of Labor's campaign for gender equality and quotas in Parliament. As a woman in leadership myself, I find the idea that we need quotas for women to be in leadership insulting, that they need quotas to be in leadership rather than being in leadership based on their own merit. I can understand that there might be, there may have been issues that meant it's more difficult for women to be in parliamentary positions, and that's why there's less women in those positions. But I am concerned that if we put women in these positions based on quotas, that it'll call into question the competency of women in leadership roles who well deserve to be there, I'm sure, including yourself. I'm concerned that the question will hang over women in Parliament, and I guess as it spills out more broadly, as to whether women are in roles because of their gender or because of their skills. And so my question is, for the whole panel, do you think quotas will fix this problem effectively, or can you see a better way forward for women in Parliament and for our nation?
Anika.
Well, Rachel, I don't feel a shred of shame being part of a party that is using affirmative action as a bridge to a more equal future, because quotas didn't require us to lower our standards, it required us to raise them. What quotas does is force people, be it political parties, companies, powerful people, to look for merit where they haven't looked for it before. That's what it does, because we know that talent is everywhere, but we also know that opportunities aren't. And I think we could all agree here that there is no particular demographic that is more inherently gifted than any other group. So if we've got a system, and in this case it's the federal parliament, that is consistently throwing up a particular cohort of people over everybody else, can we really say that that system is meritorious? I don't think we can. And if that's the case, then quotas, targets, guides, whatever it is a way to remedy that and give us the diversity that is the strength of a representative democracy. And I'd say if the task is for a representative democracy to represent Australia and it isn't doing that, then we're failing at the very first hurdle.
And I completely agree. And Rachel, I would add that merit argument, it's not a meritocracy. When you look at the research and you look at the data and you look at things like when there are blind CVs or blind auditions for orchestras, you find that people with talent are more likely to progress. Or if someone has, there was a report that came out of the UK where the exact same CVs were put forward. For example, and someone had a female ethnic name and someone had a male name, and it was the male who was called for an interview. It had nothing to do with their merit and everything to do with implicit bias. And so when you remove those structures, and then you look to the evidence of what happens when you remove those structures. So if you look at places like Sweden and in Italy, it has actually increased the level of education of parliamentarians when they have implemented quotas. But quotas alone aren't the answer, because sometimes there is that pushback that you mentioned. You have to change the culture of an organisation. So I never think that quotas or targets are the silver bullet. You have to also address bullying, discrimination and harassment. And then you have to measure and you have to remedy anything that hasn't reached its goal. And it takes time. I think for Labor it's taken 30 years or 25 years. But I would say that gender doesn't go far enough. And if you look at our politics is very white. And if you look at this audience and if you look at Australia's population, it's very multicultural. Where are our Asian and Indian politicians? Why aren't they in positions of power? Because it's not that they're not good enough. And when it comes to people who are reluctant, it's usually blokes and it's usually white blokes who push back. They go, oh, it's not fair and, you know, the best person should get the job, and they're the sorts of things I often hear. And the only person who should be worried is if they truly believe that the only reason they got the job is because they are white, because they are male, because they went to a sandstone university, because their dad golfs with somebody who was able to recommend them. If they believe that's the only reason they got the job, then they should be worried about quotas, because chances are they don't have the merit to have that job.
Martyn, what's your response?
Well, I want to first qualify that I employ more women than men, and I have a very multicultural workforce. In fact, I'm not sure that it's even majority white, so I just need to be that clear about that. It's completely equal. We pay everybody the same for the same role, and that's our legal obligation. But here's the other side of this. Quotas say a couple of things. Some of them might be good, but some of them I'm concerned about. One of the things that, sorry to be the stereotypical white guy in this as well, but one of the things it says is that a parliament that is a majority men or a majority women or a majority one race or another cannot govern in the common interest, cannot govern for the common good, cannot actually seek after what is right and true. Actually, the melanin count in my skin doesn't change my access to truth. It doesn't change my ability to do good or do right.
But it changes your lived experience. It changes your lived experience. It changes your lens. It changes where you are in terms of privilege. It absolutely changes things.
There's one thing.
It doesn't mean that you can't have empathy. It doesn't mean you're not clever and good at your job, but you don't bring skin. You don't have skin in the game. When it comes to women's issues, when it comes to Indigenous issues, you just don't get it as much as somebody who has walked in those shoes.
I totally accept that people from different backgrounds have different experiences, but I'm not sure that the categories of identity politics, male, female, black, white, gay, straight, I don't know if those are actually the right categories or the only categories that you can select. And I also don't think, as I said again, that they change someone's ability to govern in the common interest. Because the opposites are mixed up. It's not black versus white. It's not man versus woman. It's not gay versus straight. It's good versus evil. And the access to what is right and what is wrong.
Teela, can I bring you in on this?
Back to your question about quotas. Look, I don't know any First Nations woman that's marching and protesting for quotas. They're out here asking for self-determination, for sovereignty, for the dignity to not be incarcerated and locked up. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think that we really have to deal with the conversation about systemic racism, and power and privilege and the way in which those function in our society in order to seriously, fundamentally address the way in which the white patriarchy often, dominates on white supremacy in this country. And I think we really haven't grappled with that issue as a country. We are still in this hangover period of after 250 years later since invasion and colonisation, in where, we have these systems of power operating, and we still have no recognition of the sovereignty of First Nations peoples, and that means we have a disproportionate effect of Indigenous peoples incarcerated, of, Aboriginal women are the highest incarcerated cohort in the country right now. That is nothing to be proud of. So while we're out here talking about quotas, there's a lot more work to be done. And I think an example of, women at the top or wherever they are, if you look at the experiences of some women at the top, you take, for example, Julia Gillard, that was her horrendous experience to witness as a young woman, but also I can't even imagine what she experienced. And that's looking at a white woman. So I wouldn't even want to know what a black woman experiences in those contexts. So yeah, that's just my take. And quotas may be the beginning of the conversation, but they're certainly not the end.
Trent, as far as current conversations are concerned, do you support quotas in your own party because it has such a terrible record with female representation?
Well, I have to say that 10 years ago I would have taken Rachel's view, but my view has changed because we have tried lots of other strategies, some more earnestly than others, and we have failed to get to where we should be as a party. And I'd make 3 points about quotas. Firstly, they are already an intrinsic part of our political system. In fact, our parliament works on the basis of quotas because we have a Senate where we have quotas based on where you live. So the 500,000 residents of Tasmania get as many senators as the 8 million residents of New South Wales as a quota to protect our federation. And it is therefore inbuilt in what we do in that geographic way. The other point I'd make is that I think the other part of the equation is representation, and I do think it is important that our parliament is representative of the diversity of Australia. I do think that it is hard for a man to walk in a woman's shoes. I don't think Martyn can walk in a gay man's shoes as easily as a gay man. It's that diversity and representation which makes our parliament stronger. And the final point I'd make is that there is a lot of talk, and I understand it, about shouldn't it just be on merit. I have to say in my experience, and I've sat through hundreds of pre-selections, that merit is usually defined by the person arguing that their selection is going to be the most meritorious. And merit is one of those things which is a nirvana which I don't think actually is really properly ever explained. So at a pre-selection, A lot of candidates get pre-selected because they've been involved in the party for all of their life. Is that meritorious? They get pre-selected because they're actively involved in their local community. You could have a world-leading scientist but not an activist in their local community, but that is often the criteria that's used. So merit is a very hard-to-define concept that I think we rely on as some given, some certain, which it always isn't. So I think for the Liberal Party to better represent the community, it is time that we looked at quotas. It'll be hard. It'll be hard. It'll be hard because we don't have the...
go beyond gender? Because so often the diversity strategies that we have, even in corporate Australia, they kind of start and stop at gender, and they don't look at things like disability or culture. What's your view on that?
Well, I think we've got to catch up on gender first, but I agree with your point that the parliament is needs to reflect the diversity of multicultural Australia. We've made great strides. 5 years ago, I was the first openly gay member of the House of Representatives. Now there's 5 of us. We've had, believe it or not, the first person of Indian heritage in Dane Sharma elected to the lower house. But I agree with you. If you look at the multicultural nature of Australian society, the parliament is still not adequately representing the community.
While Rachel's point was about the experience of women in Parliament, I think Teela's point is important too. There's 2 issues we've got running live at the same time as this crisis unfolds in Canberra. There's the experience of women in Parliament and what we can do, what practical steps we can do to make that a better experience, make it a more welcoming place, get better people in, get more diverse people in. But the experience of systemic discrimination in this country also needs to be addressed, whether that is the systemic discrimination faced by women, the 31% gender pay gap, women over 55 are the fastest growing cohort of homeless people, whether it's the incarceration rates of First Nations women.
I just think it's a good point that, was made by both sides here, is that, for example, the LNP got elected on a policy platform in 2019 that was on enshrining a First Nations voice in the Constitution. That was the election platform. There was $7.3 million set aside for the design process of that, and also an earmarking of $160 million for a referendum. And when you're talking about representation and structural change and dismantling systemic racism and power in this country, we need to seriously get on with the work that this party was elected on, which is to ensure that our country gets to a referendum, not as an endpoint, but a beginning point in resetting the relationship between First Nations peoples and the rest of this country, because that is the part of the healing we need to have.
Let's take our next question. It's from Alan Millet.
I am a 60-year-old out and proud gay man. I have been happily partnered to a fabulous man for 28 years. I respect the right of people of all faiths to practice their faith and live the life that they choose. What makes me really angry is that some people feel they need to get involved in restricting my basic human rights, like being protected from discrimination, particularly in employment and in the provision of services, along with being free from hearing and reading hate speech about me. The Australian Christian Lobby spent an obscene amount of money this week running full-page ads in the press to support a campaign for a very wealthy sportsman to earn more millions playing football. A footballer with a history of not following the direction of his employer by posting social media posts that were derogatory towards my community. My question to you, Martyn Iles, is if Jesus came back today, what would he do?
I beg your pardon, I missed your name.
Alan.
Alan, thank you for the question, and it's important, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to answer it in front of you and others who are watching. There was a word in the question which I'd like to address first, and then I'll address Israel Folau, if that's okay. The first word I'd like to address is the word hate. Hate is a word that is thrown around a lot. I see it every day thrown at me. It's a very, very serious word. It refers to somebody's motive. It's an attitude of heart that would like to see someone else come into harm. Jesus said effectively that if you hate your brother, then you've murdered him in your heart. It's a very serious thing. For a Christian to hate is a bad sin. The reality is this: a Christian never looks fundamentally at another person as an enemy to be destroyed, and that's the danger of politics, that we can get sucked into that. We never look at the other person as somebody who we would like harm to befall. We only ever, and I cannot say this strongly enough, We only ever look at people as souls to be saved, and that includes me. And so
can I just, Martyn, draw you back to the question, though?
Yes.
He's asking you about Israel Folau.
Correct. So on the Israel Folau question, I think it's crucially important to understand what Israel Folau said, because it actually answers everything for me. The media have repeatedly said that Israel condemned homosexuals to hell, condemned homosexuals to hell, and that's what they've said. Now, that is not the overall point of the post that he made. It's taken as a whole that is not even the main thing that he said or the point that he was trying to make. What he said was that sinners are destined for judgment, and yes, Christians understand that as hell, and all of us will stand before God and will all be judged. But then he turned to the other side of the coin and he said, and forgiveness awaits to all who repent and put their trust in the Lord Jesus Christ, because he died for our sin and he offers us a life unto God. He said all of that in his post, and either you believe both sides of that coin, in which case you're free. You have condemnation and salvation. You have judgment, you have release. You have repentance, you have faith. Or you believe neither side of the coin, and good luck to us all if we don't, and you don't have a problem. And if Israel Folau can lose his livelihood because he said that, then we should hunt out every single Christian in this country who works anywhere and fire them on the spot, because they all believe it and they have all said something similar at some stage in their life, including the church.
I appreciate the context and the explanation, but if we talk about why Israel Folau was stood down, it was because he breached social media protocols and he was asked not to post those sorts of things. So it wasn't about, and I enjoyed listening to your analogy and your interpretation, but it wasn't about what he said. It was about his professional conduct and what was expected of him. And in terms of some of the ads that you have run, I personally believe that, I believe he should have been stood down. I don't believe he should spread such hate, and I know that I've seen the sort of damage that...
It's not hate. I just want to be really clear about that.
It depends where you're sitting. It depends where you're sitting. But it obviously hurt and harmed people. But in terms of him coming back, I think that he should come back. I think that we have seen NRL players who have been, there's a Penrith Panthers player who was charged and found guilty of filming and distributing a sexual act without the person's consent. He now works again, and I think it's really dangerous if we allow convicted criminals to return and then somebody who's breached a social media protocol and caused damage. I think he should have been reprimanded in the way he was, but I think it's probably time for him to come back. But I would also, one last thing.
I just want to bring in Trent, because you might have a different observation to those posts that Israel Folau made. Are they as benign as Martyn describes?
Well, I think I think the other side of the coin, and I'm not a religious person, but I was brought up in a religious family in the Uniting Church, and may not have been about hate, but it was certainly about love, and I don't see much love coming from Israel Folau, I have to say. And I just find that I don't think that you are speaking about the universal views of every Christian when you outline that view. And I'm interested, Martyn, I have no intention of repenting being gay. I'm wondering whether you think that's going to leave me when I lose this mortal coil.
What will happen to Trent if he doesn't repent?
I'll answer the question, and the answer is this simple. The answer is that God commands all people everywhere to repent. It's not a gay thing. It's not a trans thing. It's not an LGBT thing. It's a person thing. And I always say to people, the day that I found out I was a sinner going to hell was the best day of my life, because it turned me in the right direction, actually made me seek God, and actually that was the gateway to life.
But I can tell you, but your interpretation of seeing that path to God involves me in some way repenting who I am, and I'm not prepared to do that under any circumstances, even if I'm positive. But coming back to the more substantive issue, I think firstly, there is a broader debate to be had about the extent to which an employer can regulate an employee in their private time. But I'd say two things. Firstly, one, if you're a first grade rugby player, you have higher responsibilities and higher expectations on you. But secondly, this is also a workplace issue. This is about showing respect for people, be they straight or gay, that you're working with. And I just don't think that effectively telling your work colleagues that you think that they're likely to go to hell is a particularly conducive way of encouraging people in the workplace. And And I'd just make the final point that since then he has gone on to make comments like the fact that he believes that last year's bushfires, which caused so much devastation and harm, were God's punishment for same-sex marriage. Now, I'm not sure whether that qualifies as hate, but it certainly incites people not to think particularly kindly of people in a same-sex relationship, I would have to argue.
Can I just make two
Let's just bring Anika.
Yeah, sure. I just need to clarify one factual thing.
Sure, after. We haven't addressed Alan's point about the money that was invested by the Australian Christian Lobby in these full-page ads in very expensive daily papers. You know, in the Bible, there are 3,000 references to poverty and alleviating poverty, and very few references to homosexuality. So why can't the ACL spend their capital, their time, their campaign resources on alleviating poverty in this country? Why can't you campaign for a rise in job seekers?
I think everybody would love it if the ACL did exactly what they wanted us to do. The fact is that the top 25 charities in this country, I think 23 of them actually had a faith basis, and they work on alleviating poverty, and I say, wonderful work, more power to them. I myself was involved in youth work for a period of 6 years with disadvantaged kids. There is a huge wealth of Christian charity in that regard. ACL has a certain area that we focus on, which is the political realm, and the reason, I mean, we spent that much money on that ad. I'm here to tell you, we spend many times that on defending Margaret from Blacktown, Patricia from Sydney, Jason from Perth, Byron and Kira from Perth, who are no longer foster parents.
But what does it do to your membership, though, when you mount a campaign around Israel for that? What does it do for your membership?
Our members support Israel because of what I just said before to Alan.
But is it sort of a lightning rod that you use to attract people to the...
Absolutely not. I do this because it is the right thing to do, because Israel Folau's case is my case, because he believes what mainstream Christians in this country believe. He believes what the Scripture says. The Apostles said it. Jesus said it. The first words out of John the Baptist's mouth were repent. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. The first words out of Jesus' mouth were repent. They said to the Apostles on the day of Pentecost in Acts, what must we do? And he said, repent and believe. And this is the gospel message.
But he went further than that. He identified the sins that should cause you to repent. Which
well, of course.
Included homosexuality, and I'm not convinced that the majority of Christians hold that view in this country.
There's no homogenous view.
May I say one thing? I just want to clarify something Antoinette said, which is that he did not break a contract, he did not break a clause. If he did, it would have been relied upon by the tribunal that disciplined him. It wasn't relied on because it didn't exist. That's a lie that was put out, I believe, by Rugby Australia to try and ruin his reputation. Israel Folau did not expect what was coming. His whole Instagram was Bible verses and Bible quotes. And I tell you what...
Look, Rugby Australia is not here to defend themselves, but I'm sure they would assert they weren't lying. I just want to bring in Chris Breen, you're a young Christian. How do you view these discussions? I mean, do you think it's easy to be young and Christian and to say your piece in public?
Well, yeah, I'm a law student at UTS, and I've had many discussions about various political issues, whatever they may be. And almost every time, whenever I bring up my faith as a basis for an argument, it's shut down, it's told it's irrelevant. And there seems to be some specific disparity where when you have freedom of speech around your faith, that it's less valuable than people who don't have a basis on that argument. And I just hate being grouped in the same category as people who weaponize faith as a way to attack people and cause hatred versus the everyday Christian like me who just wants to express their point of view, engage in political discussions. And this just seems to me like this huge message that Rugby Australia has sent to Australia saying that if you express your faith, then you will be met with severe career-ending consequences, and that just doesn't sit well with me.
Teela. I just think back to the gentleman's point in the beginning, it was his experience of feeling the hate, and that's his response.
So is there a difference between intention and outcome?
Well, you know, he's expressed it. He's said that to me is hate speech. You know, you have to think about the way in which people respond and feel and react to those circumstances. It's not just about your opinion or, you know, what the rule book says. And I think, you know, the hero of the week for me has been Little Nas, who's come out of the US with his, you know, having experienced his...
well, let's worship Satan.
Well, you know, it's art.
I think you might need to
expression.
You might need to explain for the Q&A audience who and what Little Nas is.
And for the panel.
He's a Black American gay young man, and he had felt.
Who released
such,
a Satan shoot.
Can you
Hence
just
my
let
comment.
me speak?
I just needed
just let me
to
speak.
clarify, but yes, carry on.
And he's released, a new song recently, and part of the film clip is him in Satan, in the moment. And I just think, while I look at that and I go, look, that's his expression, he has since said that was his reaction of feeling the self-hate for so long. And I just think, look, each to their own in terms of religion and experiences and expression, but it shouldn't come at a cost where someone is feeling the hate. And that is what that gentleman up the back had just expressed.
OK, let's take our next question. It comes from Lewis Hanson Easy.
Mr. Iles, as a Christian myself, I'm honestly bemused by your comments. You don't seem to understand that many Christians, like myself and many others, believe in transgender rights and believe that God loves you, whoever you are. Why do we need so much political influence when we are ultimately paying our MPs to represent us, not our religion or lack therefore of?
I'll go to Anika on this first.
Well, thanks for your question, Lewis. I know it was to Martyn, but I'm sorry that you are experiencing that. And I think we're sort of covering issues of representation and diversity tonight. I think what representation is, if you're an elected rep, is to spend the time and take the time to understand the experiences of everyone that you represent in your community. And diversity is about bringing your own unique story, your own unique experience to that conversation, whilst understanding everybody else's experiences at the table. And the good thing is that anyone can be a good representative if they take the time, if they do the work. And what I hope is that you will find yourself an elected rep who does do that, and you do feel that you are seen and you are heard and you are represented in our democracy.
Martyn, the question was put to you, is about opposition to transgender rights. Can you explain that?
I have some concerns about the transgender issue, which I'll explain. And maybe I'll explain it by telling a quick story.
No, just briefly, if you could.
No,
just
very brief.
You've had plenty of time, so if you could just explain your position on transgender rights.
30 seconds.
Make it quick.
Robert Hoogland, Canadian father. Daughter went to school, was referred to a counsellor, said she was transgender. Without his knowledge, went to a clinic. All of a sudden was recommended for hormones. He tried to get involved at the tender age of 14. She can't even approve. She's not even allowed to get a tattoo in the state of Australia because she's 14. She's a minor. She can't even choose her own bedtime. But the transgender clinic says she needs to go on hormones, which are irreversible, which will make her sterile for the rest of her life. The dad said, "I'm sorry, I don't want that to happen." And he was smart because 90% of them grow out of it. And the clinic said, "You know what? We don't need your consent."
Where's that figure from, the 90%?
It's between 76 and high 80%.
But where are you getting that from?
You speak with a lot of authority for someone who doesn't have that experience. Lewis has that experience. He's asking you to listen to him.
I just want to check, where are those figures from?
Those figures, look, I've been briefed on these from a range of studies which have been done, which show that...
Conducted by who?
If a person... I don't actually have it on me.
Okay.
And I can... you know what, I'll post it on my Facebook page after this show, all right? So everyone has access to it. That would be the best thing to do, I think. But the reality is, if a child at the age of 10, who, as I said, can't even decide to get a tattoo, even with parental consent in this country for good reasons, they're minors, then goes and says, well, I want to change my gender and have irreversible procedures done to me. What actually ultimately happened to Robert was that because he told the media about what happened to his daughter and the fact that he was going to be a domestic abuser for calling her she, or for saying, look, I'd rather that she waited, he's her father, for heaven's sake. Okay. He is in jail tonight as we speak. He's in jail right now.
I think that's a very specific...
This is where the transgender thing is
but I think that's a very specific
and
example.
laws are passed in Victoria.
And we don't know all of the detail. But I think, to your point, the Australian Christian lobby, obviously with its umbrella name, Christian, there are variations of Christianity. There are and people who believe, very, very, uber conservative on one side, progressive with LGBT pastors on the other. And I think when the ACL puts themselves forward as having quite hard-line, very right views, they don't represent all Christians. They alienate other Christians. And of course there's going to be differences of opinion. So I'm not interested in speaking about this specific example because I don't really think it gets to the heart of the fact that other Christians don't believe and support all of the ACL's policy views. And I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to say.
Look, well, firstly, on the principle, I mean, I think that any person should be able to decide what future they want for their own life and what they do with their body as part of that. In relation to young people, the law is very different in Australia to that experience which you've outlined. But I'd make the broader point that we talk a lot in this country, as we should, about issues like mental health and suicide. There is one group that has the highest incidence of attempted suicide, and that's the trans community. The LGBTI community more broadly is not far behind.
Indigenous youth.
I think Indigenous youth as well. And I think we have to be very careful about the language we use in those circumstances, because these are people that are going through extraordinary change in their lives, and often that is difficult. I know what it's like coming to terms with being gay. I can only imagine what it's like coming to terms with being in a body that you don't think fits. It's an extraordinary thing you have to go through in your life. So I think we've got to be very careful about questioning whether transgenderism is a legitimate course for an individual to take, and reflect on the fact that it is such a difficult process.
Do you think it is dangerous to be questioning it in the way that Martyn does?
Look, I haven't explored all of Martyn's or ACL's comments in relation to this, but and I never want to stifle legitimate debate, but I think that there is an element of language that I've seen in Australia which basically sort of starts on the premise that you're either a man or a woman, nothing in between. I don't know what people argue that would say to someone from the intersex community, but also deny the possibility that someone's gender might not reflect their physical body. And I think that is dangerous for someone who's going through that extraordinarily emotional experience.
And I think the difficult territory we're in, and I absolutely support, and I have my faith, and I absolutely support that people should have their beliefs. And it's finding that balance to have the freedom to be with each other rather than the freedom from each other. And I think sometimes that can be a bit of a slippery slope. Like, you can have your beliefs, but don't deny the experiences and the existence of others. And I know with issues such as trans, that's difficult territory to navigate. So I don't have the answer.
All right. If this conversation raises any issues for you, you can always contact Lifeline. The number is 13 11 14. Our next question comes from Latoya Rule.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm an Aboriginal queer non-binary person coming to you today, so this is in that context. My mother sits next to me. Her name's Caroline Anderson, and we're on stolen Gadigal land. My brother and my mum's son is Wayne Fella Morrison, who died in custody in 2016. Abolitionist scholar Sharon Dev Singh explains that at the end of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody in April 1991, one Aboriginal person was dying in custody every 3 weeks. 30 years later, Aboriginal people are dying in custody every 5 days. A number of our families, including Senator Dodson and Senator Thorpe, recently requested to meet with the Prime Minister. So when will the government sit down with Aboriginal families like mine and actually listen to our solutions? Maybe, June?
Mm-hmm. Trent.
Well, I think it is important that government listen to the stories of people who have been through the awful circumstances that you have been, and both the state and the federal level. So I'm happy to pass on that request if we talk afterwards. But I think listening to your experiences is important. We're coming up to the 30th anniversary of the Royal Commission. Black deaths in custody remain too high, way too high. But what really worries me is that we're seeing probably in many instances, and Teela will know this better than me, a worsening trend in relation to incarceration of Indigenous Australians. So I think one of the fundamental points the Royal Commission made was that the basic problem was that too many Indigenous Australians were being locked up too often, and that's really at the root of what we've got to try to address. I wouldn't profess to know the answers. I really don't. But I'm happy to try and facilitate that for you and your family.
Sorry, I wanted to bring Teela back in on this. Clearly, the statistics since that Royal Commission was handed down have not improved. We're talking about 5 deaths, Indigenous deaths in custody since the start of March this year. Do you have a view as to, given the work that you do, as to why this has not changed? This hasn't moved. We have not shifted the dial.
I just want to say, Latoya, I'm so sorry for your loss, and you have been on the front line of this battle, along with many other families, for so long now, and including your mum. And I absolutely do hope that you get heard and the dignity to have the seat at the table and have your lived experiences shared and listened to and acted upon. As a First Nations person, 30 years after the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, I have now become a lawyer for many different reasons, and it is so heartbreaking to know, as you alluded to, Senator Dodson said the other day in estimates, we're here at the 30th anniversary and there's almost 500 deaths, and the response from Senator Stoker was vile. It was just dismissive, and it
What
just...
was it?
She said all lives matter.
Yes.
In the Senate. If we're still using the rhetoric employed by white supremacists, then I think we've got a problem. We're not even acknowledging the problem, let alone addressing it.
And just back to your question, which is there were 339 recommendations out of that Royal Commission, and the inconsistencies between the states and the feds and who's taking responsibility for implementing those is just so unclear. It's so incoherent, and what we see as a result is more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people dying. And I think there are many layers to this issue. But for example, this is state-sanctioned violence. This is state-sanctioned violence against the bodies of Black and brown people in this country, where it has become part of the narrative in this country that Aboriginal people die in custody, and there's no accountability for that. And I think we need to remember that part of the core recommendations was ensuring the self-determination and structural changes around accountability and processes that are independent of the government. And I think that it's just so important that, that families who with the lived experiences continue to be heard. And you have to have, so for example, if you've got police over-policing Black and brown communities where they're trained to, respond in particular ways, what you're seeing is if there is a particular death or passing, that there is no accountability, because that's how they're trained to respond. Like, we need to address the issue at so many different levels, and I just think the families who have experienced this need the dignity to be heard at front and centre. And I should say, this Saturday there is a National Day of Action that the families who have experienced this are calling, so everyone needs to turn up on the front line for those, but to also do the work every day and to ensure this is not an Aboriginal problem, this is an Australian problem. Everyone in this country needs to prioritise the fact that we need to act on this issue. And until we do, there will be no truth and there will be no justice for these families or First Nations peoples.
Our next question tonight comes from Ursima Pang.
Hi, my background is Christian, and a lot of the time I'm seeing things in the media and in the news about extremism, and I'm just concerned that these small activists and groups are being brought together with larger groups like the ACL and just general just generally everyday Christians who have a right-wing conservative view, just how that impacts us as a community, and those views of seeing us as part of that.
I'm just going to take you back to what I think your question was about, which was about terrorism, right? Yes, and the labelling of terrorism.
Yes. So, I find that the vast majority of right-wing groups in Australia are not embedded in any form of extremism, and they shouldn't be. Shouldn't these groups be treated more like terrorists rather than right-wing groups, as they don't represent the right-wing worldview, and also neo-Nazi radical groups in Australia, which I think there are 4, shouldn't they be called terrorists for their actions rather than right-wing politics?
Antoinette Lattouf, this is ultimately about labelling, right,
Yeah,
of
sure.
terrorism groups, and ASIO has said that it's going to designate things differently
Really
to what it has done in the past.
Yeah.
We're now going to refer to them as religiously inspired
That's really-
extremism rather than Muslim extremism, as might have
and
been done in
ideologically inspired
Yeah.
extremism. So firstly, I'd address, I don't think the extremism we're seeing on the far right is all connected to Christianity. And so I just wanted to address that in the first instance. And so recently ASIO has come out and said that they're going to rename them. And I find that particularly interesting, given that for 20 or 21 years, or since September 11, we were happy to call it Islamic extremism. But now that it's far-right extremism, and perhaps it hits too close to home, or perhaps ostracises some of the coalition's voting base, that they don't want to call it that. So let's perhaps muddy the water or change the name.
Why does it not work that way? Just explain.
So ASIO makes these decisions itself, and it's recategorised both how religious extremism is described, so it is described in those terms rather than a particular religion. And
so why was it okay to call it Islamic extremism for 21 years?
well, they're changing, and I think that's a good thing. But that doesn't stop ASIO. I don't think that stops ASIO then defining in particular incidents what they believe the root cause is. I mean, they've made quite clear that they will continue to do that. But in terms of describing to the Australian community where the threats are, they are talking about effectively two types: religious violent extremism and ideological violent extremism.
I just think
and that's ASIO's call, it's not the government's.
Well, okay, well, let's put ASIO aside. I think the coalition has done a terrible job at confronting a real and growing threat. So ASIO came out last year and said their workload in the past 5 years in dealing with white supremacists and neo-Nazis has tripled. The United Nations has called, it's now the #1 terror threat in the United States and a bunch of other Western democracies. During COVID, Altogether Now, who's doing great work at the front line of this, it says we are seeing, because of the isolation, more time spent inside and online, an increase in this. What does our government respond? Oh, well, when ASIO came out, Dutton said, oh, well, we have to worry about left-wing extremism as well. ASIO has not said anything about the threat of left-wing extremism. They've now called for, I think, a parliamentary inquiry kicks off next month, looking into extremism. But again, Dutton has jumped in and said, well, let's look at Islamic extremism as well. Why don't we just call a spade, look at the issue that is growing, let's call it what it is. I just think it perhaps makes them uncomfortable, because the modern face of a terrorist in Australia could look like Hamish, could look like you. And until we have these discussions about what it looks like... Sorry.
I look so damn innocent, though, Antoinette. All right, we're going to have to wrap it up there. That's all we've got time for tonight. Would you please thank our wonderful panel: Trent Zimmerman, Teela Reid, Anika Wells, Martyn Iles and Antoinette Lattouf. Thanks also to those of you here in the studio and those of you at home for joining us tonight, and to those of you streaming us on iView. Next week, we're in Melbourne talking about the big issues of the week, including our troubled relationship with China. Please send in your questions now. We're finishing off tonight, though, with some beautiful music from the wonderful Robbie Miller. His debut album, Little Love, is about finding happiness, being honest with who you are and, importantly, who you aren't. Here's Robbie with Catch Me.
Catch me on the train ride home. Whispers that build me up. Selfishly I sell my soul, building for a bigger up. Even if I get some sleep, the world's just spinning at my feet. Catch me on the way back down, right before I hit the ground, twisting to the deep blue sea, building on a bigger dream. Even if I get some sleep, sleep, the wheels are spinning at my feet. Catch me on the train ride home. Whisper words that build me up. Selfishly I sell my soul, building for a bigger up. Even if I get some sleep, the wheels are spinning at my feet. Even if I get some sleep, wheels are spinning at my feet. Catch me on the train ride home.